Hello? What if the girl who scrubbed the floor was the rightful queen of the empire that buried her name? In this story, we discover the truth they tried to erase, and what she became when she finally found out who she was. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if your entire past had been a lie? Let's listen to the story. The winter of 1231 did not arrive quietly. It came howling through the narrow valleys of Vacia, a forgotten kingdom crumbling under its own silence. Snow fell like ashes over the blackened fields, where soldiers once pledged loyalty and spilled blood in equal measure. But this night, it was not a battle, it was a purge. The last cries of the royal family echoed through the stone corridors of the inner castle. Cries not of warriors, but of women, children, loyal servants, one by one silenced. A final order had been given by the new ruler, Lord Armand of Velgrath. No bloodline shall remain, no heir, no rumor, no hope. Yet somewhere within the chaos, inside a chamber hidden behind the chapel walls, a baby girl screamed against fate, wrapped in a wool blanket with the sigil of the old queen. 3 silver lilies on a field of blue. She was not saved by sword or crown, but by guilt. A young guard, trembling, drenched in sweat and shame, took the child in his arms and fled under moonlight. He had no plan, only regret. For 2 days, he rode north, through frozen forests and nameless paths. His horse collapsed just miles from a forgotten monastery nestled in the shadows of the Ironwood Mountains. There, monks found the child. The guard said nothing, only wept, and died the next morning. The monks, bound by silence and secrecy, took her in. They named her Evelyn. They burned the blanket. They buried the sigil. They swore to never speak of her past. And so, Vacia was no more. Its castles were divided, its name erased from maps, its people silenced. And the only living heir grew up believing she was no one. She never saw the scrolls written in her name, never touched the crown that once belonged to her blood. She learned to scrub floors, carry buckets, whisper prayers, and keep her head down. She was taught that being invisible was the safest way to exist. Years passed, the world moved on, but the truth never dies, it only sleeps. And in the cold corners of kingdoms and memories, there were still a few who remembered the lilies of Vacia and the child that was never found. By her 20th winter, Evelyn had forgotten the chill of the monastery walls. She now lived in the service halls of House Belvoir, a lesser noble family loyal to the empire. Descendants of opportunists who had prospered after Vacia's fall. To them, she was a quiet hand, a nameless girl who moved through shadows, carrying firewood and fetching water before dawn. The lady of the house called her Mouse, and the kitchen maids called her worse. Evelyn never argued, not when her hands bled from the cold, not when they poured wine over her head in mockery, not even when they whispered that her eyes were too sharp for a peasant. She simply cleaned, bowed, and disappeared into her silence again. But there was something they couldn't name. Something that lingered in the way she watched the snow fall, or how she never flinched under cruelty. A quiet strength, a depth no one could explain, as if her soul remembered something her mind had been forced to forget. And then came the visitor, an old man, stooped and weathered, dressed like a court scholar, arrived under the guise of inspecting House Belvoir's records. He took meals alone, asked few questions, and spent hours in the candlelit study. But on the 3rd night, he asked for more wood, and Evelyn was the one who brought it. He watched her, not with lust, not with suspicion, but with reverence and sorrow. He asked her name, her age, where she was born, simple questions. She answered with the softness of someone used to being ignored. Then he smiled strangely. "Forgive me," he said. "You remind me of a story I once heard, about a child that disappeared during a winter like this." Evelyn said nothing, but something in her chest, something buried beneath years of stillness, shifted. The old man left the next morning. No farewells, no notes, only a glance as he climbed into his carriage, like he was seeing something no one else could see. 3 weeks later, Evelyn vanished, dragged from her bed before sunrise, a sack over her head, tied wrists, no explanation. When the maids asked, they were told she had stolen from the cellar and fled. But there was no search, no outrage, just silence. And far from the eyes of House Belvoir, across snow-covered passes and forgotten trails, Evelyn was taken to a place no longer marked on any imperial map, a ruined fortress carved into the cliffs. There, surrounded by strangers cloaked in rebellion and history, she would come face to face with the truth that had been buried with her name. She was not a servant. She was the last breath of a kingdom, and the embers of Vasia were about to burn again. The fortress was a scar on the mountainside, black stone, half swallowed by snow and silence. Once a stronghold of Vasia's royal guard, it had long since been stripped of its banners, its name erased from every map, its halls abandoned to frost and time. Yet within its broken walls, torches still burned. Evelyn was led inside by 2 men who spoke little and moved with discipline. Not brigands, not imperials, something in between. Soldiers without a country. She was cold, starving, confused, but not afraid. Because somewhere beneath her disorientation, a strange calm had settled. As if a locked door in her memory had begun to creak open. Inside, a small group awaited her. 5 figures, cloaked and watchful. One of them was the old scholar. He stood before her now, stripped of his courtly disguise, wrapped in a worn Vesian mantle. His name was Alric Tevenel, once royal archivist, now leader of a forgotten cause. "I know you have questions," he began, "but before answers, you must see." They brought her to a chamber beneath the fortress, a room untouched by the outside world. Dust danced in torchlight. Stone walls were lined with scrolls, relics, and fragments of banners bearing the sigil of the falcon and flame, the royal crest of Vesia. And at the center, on a pedestal, lay a small preserved book bound in white leather. Alric opened it with trembling hands. Inside, birth records, sealed decrees, a lock of golden hair tied with red thread, the proof. "You are Evelyn of Vesia," he said, "daughter of Queen Melis, born the night the capital fell, smuggled from the palace by a guard who defied his orders, hidden in a monastery for your safety. You are the last of the bloodline, and whether you wish it or not, you are our only hope." Evelyn couldn't speak. The room swam, her breath caught. She looked down at her own hands, rough from labor, scarred from years of servitude. Nothing royal in them, nothing noble, just survival. "Why me?" she finally whispered. Alric stepped closer. "Because the people remember, in whispers, in stories. They remember the queen who stood against the empire, and the child who vanished in the snow. If you show them that child lives, the lie begins to crack. And truth, child, is a weapon no crown can stop." But Evelyn didn't accept her role then. She didn't believe in bloodlines, in destiny, in symbols etched in stone. She was a servant, a girl who never had choices, who'd spent 2 decades invisible. She needed time, and so, for days, she walked the halls of the fortress, silent, observing. She read old chronicles by firelight, tracing her mother's handwriting. She stood on the crumbled battlements, staring out at the empire that had buried her history, and piece by piece, the silence inside her began to break. She wasn't angry. She was waking. Evelyn had seen enough. The fortress, the books, the proof. It was undeniable. She was the heir of Vessia. And with that knowledge came an unbearable weight. For the first time in her life, she felt the heavy hand of destiny pressing against her chest. She had spent years in obscurity, forgotten by time and history. But now, there was no running from what was written in those ancient scrolls, no denying the pull of what she was meant to be. Yet, in the days that followed, Evelyn found herself unable to move. She had learned of her lineage, but the decision remained with her. Could she truly claim a throne, one she had never asked for, one that had been stained by the blood of those who came before her? She was just a girl who had known nothing but hardship and servitude. No army, no riches, just the fragile threads of a past she never experienced. Alric and his companions, each driven by a different reason, pushed her. They needed her to act, to believe in the cause. But Evelyn was not yet convinced. "You were born to lead," Alric had insisted one evening as he paced the stone floor of the chamber. "Do you not feel the pulse of the land, the silence of the people? They await you." Evelyn, still with doubts, asked the only question that had consumed her mind since the first moment of truth. "But what if I fail?" Alric's face softened, a rare moment of understanding. "Then you fail, but you will have fought. That is more than they have ever done for you, and for Vessia." Days turned into weeks. Evelyn tried to stay in the shadows, allowing herself to be nothing more than an observer. But there was no escape from the movement growing around her. The whispers of rebellion had begun to take root again, fueled by her name, her existence. Everywhere she went, the people, the few loyalists left, looked at her with hope. It was in their eyes, in the way their voices cracked when they spoke her name. It was terrifying. The fortress was filled with books of every kind. Chronicles of her family, her mother's reign, the rebellions and betrayals that led to the fall. As Evelyn read, she realized the full extent of the loss. Not just her kingdom, but a people that had been enslaved by the empire, forgotten by history. Her mother's name had been erased from every record. Her father's death was spun into a tale of treachery. Her very existence had been hidden away as if it had never mattered. But that wasn't all. As she read further, the story of her mother's death began to twist into something darker, something more painful. Queen Melis had not died in battle as the records claimed. She had been betrayed by those closest to her, an inside plot devised by the very council that had sworn loyalty to her. And worse, the betrayal had not ended there. It had reached into the heart of the family. Evelyn's bloodline had been systematically erased from history, not simply by an enemy, but by those who had been too greedy to share power. The final truth came to her one night, as she stood before a map of the lost kingdom of Vessia, staring at its borders. Lines now crossed and blurred by the empire. She could fight, but even if she won, what would she be fighting for? The empire had already taken so much. Could she really return the people's hope? Could she lead them out of the shadow of a kingdom that had crumbled, leaving only ruins in its wake? But there was no turning back. The whispers were already growing louder, and this time they weren't just asking for a queen. They were asking for the queen, the one who had been lost. And then, just as she thought she could stand firm, the first wave of rebellion came. A small, covert band of exiled nobles, former soldiers, and villagers who had learned the truth of Evelyn's existence. They were a fragile, scattered force, untrained, unarmed. But they had hope, and they were willing to die for her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Evelyn stood alone in the fortress courtyard, watching as the horizon turned blood red with the coming storm. The voices of rebellion had risen, louder, clearer, and the realization settled on her. The fight had begun. She was no longer just a servant. She was the symbol of a forgotten kingdom. But the cost was clear. This would be no simple battle. Her soul would be tested, and the choices ahead would make her question everything she believed in. As she walked back into the cold stone halls, something changed in her. There was no turning back now. She had seen what it meant to live in the shadow of history, to carry the weight of 1,000 broken promises. And now, the only choice she had was whether she would be crushed by it or rise. The morning mist hung thick over the mountains, a pale shroud that seemed to swallow the fortress whole. Evelyn stood at the edge of the battlements, her eyes lost in the gray horizon. She had never felt so alone in her life. The rebellion was no longer a distant whisper. It had become a reality that demanded everything from her. And now there was no way to go back. The first major battle took place under the most unlikely circumstances. It wasn't a grand assault led by thousands, but rather an ambush in the dense woods surrounding the fortress. A group of loyalists, small, ragtag, and barely trained, had been discovered by the Empire's scouts. The clash was swift, chaotic. The cries of men, those who fought for her, echoed through the trees, followed by the crackling of flames as the fortress's outer defenses were breached. Evelyn stood on the steps of the fortress, watching helplessly as the flames reflected off the snow-covered ground. The fires seemed to consume everything. Her doubts, her fears, her very future. She had known it was coming, but the weight of it was still unbearable. Alric rushed to her side, his face grim, his clothes torn from battle. He spoke quickly, urgently. "We cannot wait any longer. We need to leave now. The Empire's forces will arrive soon." But Evelyn could not tear her gaze away from the burning woods. Her people were dying. "I'm not leaving them," she said, her voice cold and steady. Alric's face tightened in frustration. "You have a destiny, Evelyn. If you die here, everything we fought for is lost." The sound of galloping hooves interrupted them. A messenger, breathless and wide-eyed, arrived at the gates, bringing news from the battlefield. The ambush had been crushed. The survivors were either dead or scattered. But something far more devastating had happened. The Empire's forces were already marching toward the fortress. A full legion, led by General Aldrich himself, the very man who had betrayed her mother, the man responsible for the fall of Vessia, the very man she knew she would have to face. Her hand clenched around the hilt of a sword, one she had taken for the first time just days before. She didn't know how to wield it properly, but it felt like the only thing left that could connect her to the kingdom she was fighting for. The battle that followed was nothing like she imagined. It was brutal, unrelenting, and deeply personal. As the clash unfolded, Evelyn moved through the chaos with a strange clarity. She wasn't a queen yet. She was still the girl who had been raised to be nothing. But in that moment, with the weight of history bearing down on her, she fought like a woman with nothing to lose. Alric had been right about one thing: destiny had no mercy. But there was something more, something deep within her, something that had always been there, buried beneath years of servitude and silence. It was the blood of Melis, the unbroken line of a royal legacy that called her to rise. Every swing of her sword, every rallying cry she gave to her scattered forces came from that deeper place. She was not just fighting for the throne. She was fighting for the soul of her people, for the ones who had been forgotten. As the fighting reached its peak, Evelyn found herself standing face to face with General Aldrich. The air between them crackled with tension. A battle of wills as much as steel. He wore the insignia of the Empire, a symbol of the regime that had destroyed her kingdom, erased her bloodline. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling calmness as he spoke. "I never thought the day would come when I would face you, child, the last of the Melis line." His voice was cold, mocking. "You think you can undo what has been done? You think your pathetic rebellion can defeat the Empire?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of the moment, of everything she had learned, everything she had lost. The history of her family, the blood of her ancestors coursing through her veins, and the price she was willing to pay. "I'm not trying to defeat the Empire," Evelyn said, her voice steady but filled with fury. "I'm trying to free my people, and that means destroying everything you've built." Their swords clashed with a force that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Each strike was a battle, each parry a test of endurance. The fight was long, brutal, but Evelyn's resolve was unbreakable. She had already lost everything. There was no more fear in her, only the fire of a rightful heir seeking justice. And in the end, it was her sword that found its mark. General Aldrich fell with a final, resounding thud. The battlefield fell into a stunned silence as his men hesitated, unsure of what to do without their leader. Evelyn stood over him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her sword was slick with blood. She was victorious, but the price was steep. Her body ached, her hands trembled. Yet it was not her own survival that mattered now. The remnants of the Empire's forces fled. The rebels, small in number but fierce in spirit, held the fortress. For the first time in 20 years, Vesia was no longer just a memory. It had a future, however uncertain. Evelyn gazed at the horizon once more, her heart heavy with the realization of what had truly been lost. The road ahead was still long and filled with peril. The Empire would not forget so easily, and there were still battles to fight. But she was no longer the forgotten child. She was a queen in her own right, and now she would lead. The fires of the battle had long since died down, leave us behind nothing but smoldering embers and the faint scent of ash that clung to the air. Evelyn stood at the top of the crumbling fortress, looking out over the ruins of the battlefield. The winds had shifted, and the cold bite of the northern mountains now seemed to bring clarity with it. She was alone for the first time in what felt like forever. alone with the weight of her decisions, the bloodshed, and the future she had reluctantly accepted. What had she truly won? The empire was still vast, its forces still present in the lands surrounding Vesia, but the rebellion was no longer a scattered, disjointed dream. It was now an undeniable reality. There was no going back, no more pretending to be the orphaned servant she had once been. Evelyn had taken her place, not just as a symbol, but as a force of nature. The weight of her ancestors, the sacrifices they had made, now bore down on her shoulders. And yet, with all of that, a new feeling began to settle inside her. Something she hadn't expected. It was the quiet terror of leadership. She had killed a man, the very man who had orchestrated the fall of her family. And while there was some sense of triumph in that, there was also something far darker. Something that made her question the cost of justice. The cold wind picked up, and she pulled her cloak tighter around her. At that moment, Alric appeared at her side, his face weathered by the events of the past days, but his eyes still filled with the same unwavering loyalty he had shown since their first meeting. "The rebels have begun to organize," he said, breaking the silence. "We've sent word to the nearby kingdoms. Some are hesitant, but others have pledged support. The banner of Vesia will rise once more." Evelyn nodded, but her thoughts were far away. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes focused on the distant horizon. It felt as though something inside her had shifted permanently. She had killed, she had fought, and now she was expected to lead. But there was no roadmap for this, no guide to show her the way. "You're not alone in this." Alric's voice brought her back to the present. "We're all in this together. You have the people, the truth, and the bloodline. You have everything you need to lead them." Evelyn turned to him, her face softening for the first time in days. She could see the genuine belief in his eyes, but she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling inside her. "But what if I fail them?" she whispered, barely audible over the wind. Alric met her gaze, his own eyes heavy with understanding. "What if you don't?" The conversation lingered in the air like a heavy fog, but the weight of it didn't ease. Evelyn knew that the road ahead would be full of trials. The Empire would not let go of Vesia without a fight, and the people who had followed her here, who had laid their hopes at her feet, would expect more than a legacy. They would expect results. She turned away from Alric, moving toward the edge of the fortress. From there, she could see the distant villages and the remnants of her kingdom. It was all in ruins, yet it was still hers. Vesia was still alive, not in the stones of the castle or the land, but in the hearts of those who still believed in it. Her thoughts were interrupted as a figure approached. A man with a messenger's cap, holding a parchment in his hands. He bowed respectfully, but there was an urgency in his movements. "My lady, word has come from the south. The Empire is massing its forces. General Aldrich's death has ignited something. They are coming for Vesia in full force." Evelyn took the letter, her pulse quickening as she scanned the contents. The warning was clear. The Empire had mobilized everything it had to crush this rebellion, and their eyes were now on her. She had made a name for herself now. The once forgotten child was a symbol of defiance, and the Empire would not allow that to stand. "It's time," Alric said softly, his voice resolute. "We have to make a stand, Evelyn. You can't run anymore, they won't give up, and neither will we." Her heart raced as she clutched the parchment in her hand, feeling the weight of the choice she had made all over again. There would be no more hiding. The world would know who she was now and what she stood for. She didn't say anything in response. Instead, she walked past Alric down the stone steps of the fortress toward the gathering rebels. Her footsteps were heavy, each one echoing in the cold air like the thud of a battle drum. This was it, the moment of truth, the final battle that would define her and her kingdom's fate. She had already lost so much, but she would not lose them. She was no longer just a symbol of hope. She was the last living heir to Vaesia, and Vaesia would rise again. Evelyn stood by the window of the ancient castle of Vaesia, the cold mountain wind brushing against her face. Her journey had led her here, to a position of leadership she never imagined she would occupy. She, a mere servant girl, now found herself at the helm of a rebellion seeking to restore a kingdom long erased from the memories of all. The weight of the responsibility now on her shoulders was crushing. She gazed at the horizon, where the lands that once belonged to her waited for possible restoration. But what did she really know about ruling? How could she become the queen Vaesia needed when, just weeks ago, she didn't even know her true origin? The shadows of the castle stretched long like ghosts from the past. The walls were heavy with the memories of a lost empire. An empire she would now have to challenge, perhaps even destroy. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The fight was not just against external forces, but also against the weight of her own identity. That innocent child, hidden away in the monastery, was still inside her, a girl who only asked for a simple, peaceful life. But that life no longer existed. The decision had been made. Evelyn was no longer the nameless girl with no future. She was the heir of a kingdom, a leader forged by circumstance and sacrifice. And with that came the inevitable burden of ruling. She knew that the battle for her legitimacy would be only the beginning. The wounds of the past were deep, and the empire that had consumed her kingdom was vast, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. As the exiles and survivors gathered in the dark corridors of the castle, Evelyn felt a wave of loneliness. The weight of a crown she never asked for felt far too real. How could a girl raised in a secluded monastery, eating hard bread and tending to wounds, have ever imagined she would become the symbol of resistance? And yet, here she was. A messenger's cry interrupted her thoughts. Imperial troops were approaching. There was no more time to hesitate. It was time to make a definitive choice. On one hand, Evelyn knew that restoring Vaesia would mean a complete shift in the balance of power. The war that loomed would be immense, bloody, perhaps even senseless. But, on the other hand, the silence of submission meant the death of what remained of the royal bloodline, something she could never allow. She walked to the center of the war room where the leaders of the exile awaited her orders. The castle, though in ruins, still retained the grandeur of an ancient empire. The banner of Queen Melis was emblazoned with the royal crest, and as Evelyn gazed at it, she felt the weight of her lineage. "And now, Evelyn?" one of the commanders asked in a grave tone. "What will your next step be?" She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing lightly over the sword at her waist. The reflection of her own image in the shining metal made her realize what she had become. A warrior, a leader, the heir of Vaesia's past and future. Without hesitation, she lifted her chin. "Prepare for battle," she said firmly. "Today, Vesia is reborn. Evelyn turned, her resolve unwavering, and walked out, ready to face the destiny that had long been kept at bay. The battle began now, and she was finally ready to claim what had always been hers by right. Evelyn stood on the threshold of what would be her final act, her heart a storm of conflicting emotions. The past weeks had been an unrelenting march toward this moment. The rebels, those loyal to her late mother's line, had fought alongside her. But now the final, decisive battle was upon them. No longer just the quiet servant girl. She had become the embodiment of hope for a people who had lived in the shadows of oppression for far too long. As the sun set, casting a golden hue across the crumbling landscape of Vesia, Evelyn looked upon the battlefield below. Her forces had suffered losses, their spirits battered by the violence and the weight of their cause. But through it all, Evelyn had remained resolute. Her birthright, once a secret kept hidden in the darkness, had become the beacon that guided them all. She had no army, no grand titles, but the truth of her lineage, the blood of Malus, was more powerful than any throne. The battle was not just for a kingdom, but for the future of her people. It was a reckoning, a final judgment on the empire that had stolen everything from her. But the cost was clear. No victory would come without sacrifice. Her closest allies had already fallen, their bodies strewn across the battlefield like shattered dreams. And as the final confrontation loomed, Evelyn felt the weight of it all. The enemy's forces were advancing, the shadows of their ironclad army marching toward her last stand. With each step, Evelyn's resolve grew stronger. She would not let their deaths be in vain. She had come too far. Her decision, made in the quiet corners of her mind, was now being realized. She was not merely a symbol of a lost kingdom, but the leader it desperately needed. She would not only reclaim Vesia, she would reshape it. The people had suffered long enough under the rule of a foreign empire that had no care for their lives, their traditions, or their future. As the battle raged on, Evelyn led her forces into the fray, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. With each swing of her sword, with each rallying cry, she embodied the legacy of her ancestors, not just as a monarch, but as the fierce protector of her people's identity. The empire's forces, once sure of their victory, faltered. The strength of a single woman's will, an heir who had been forgotten, who had been told she was nothing, was now the very thing that broke them. Evelyn was no longer a frightened girl, uncertain of her place in the world. She had found her power, and with it, she shattered the false throne that had been built on lies and blood. When the dust settled, when the echoes of battle had faded into silence, Evelyn stood victorious. But she did not stand alone. The rebels, those who had fought beside her, their spirits now lifted, gathered around her. The people of Vesia, who had once believed their land lost forever, now saw in her the return of hope. Evelyn had restored more than just a kingdom. She had restored their belief in themselves, their future, and their right to rule their own fate. In the aftermath of the war, Evelyn took her place not as a ruler on a throne, but as the symbol of a new Vesia. She had no need for a crown. Her power was in her people, in the land they had fought to reclaim, and in the truth of her bloodline, blood that had never truly been forgotten. As she stood on the steps of the newly rebuilt palace, looking out at the kingdom she had resurrected from the ashes, she felt the weight of what she had accomplished. Her journey had not been one of glory. It had been a path of pain, loss, and sacrifice. But in the end, it was worth every step. For the kingdom of Vasia was not hers to rule alone, it was the people's. And in their eyes, she had already become something greater than any monarch. She had become their legacy, their future. And so, the story of Evelyn, the forgotten heiress, came to its end. But her reign, her story, and the kingdom she restored would be remembered long after the final page was turned. This was the story of a forgotten heiress who rose from silence to destiny. Let me know in the comments what you thought. What stood out to you the most? What question still echoes in your mind? And don't forget to like the video, it helps a lot. Bye-bye.